The Selfish Giant came about, I think the first inception was probably when Clio was researching for the Arbor, when she went up to Bradford to the Buttershaw estate, and she met a group of boys, one of whom was a 14-year-old boy called Matthew Bailey. Matty, when we came to film the Arbor, he wasn't a fundamental part of that film, but he used to ride through the back of our shop bareback on a horse from time to time, and he was helpful if if we wanted, if we were in the area and he was around and could help out. And it's a friendship that Clio kept on after the Arbor. And at one point I remember Clio saying to me, giving me more news about Matty and the fact that he had bought 2 horses and he'd built these rudimentary stables in the back of his mum's garden, and that he would go out scrap collecting with a horse and cart with his best friend, which just seemed fascinating. And at about the time before, just prior to the release of the Arbor, Clio and I had started to talk about what projects next, what ideas are you interested in, and Clio also mentioned this short story that a friend of hers gave her and she used to read to her sons, called The Selfish Giant by Oscar Wilde. I hadn't read the story, and it's a really beautiful children's story, very moving, and Clio had this connection to the material, and we started discussing whether there was a way of adapting that material and combining it, going back to Bradford and reconnecting with some of the people she'd met there and this group of boys, and particularly Matty, and whether there was a way of combining those worlds, adapting the book and with the contemporary story. This is my second project with Clio, and I think what I find fascinating about working with her is that she has an unconventional approach. I think that maybe stems from being an artist filmmaker. The projects we've worked on either have their roots in real life, the Arbor was a documentary, or they are inspired by real life, and I think that I find that very compelling. Also, with Clio, she, particularly with the people in Bradford, she makes very strong connections with people, and she has a very sort of open and engaging and collaborative personality, and I think people want to work with her or get to know her or be friends with her, whether that's inspiring the stories that she wants to work on or actually working on the projects themselves. And I think it's that collaborative nature that's also why it's so fulfilling to work on projects with her. Casting children is always one of those, there's a lot of unknowns about it. And we were in very good hands with casting director Amy Hubbard. And we started the search for the boys relatively early on. We started in April and we actually shot the film in September. And when Amy went up to Bradford and the first school on the first day, the first round of auditions, she auditioned Connor Chapman, and that night in London and Clio respectively in Whitstable, both Clio and I watched the footage that Amy had shot, and we both independently phoned Amy and said, this boy is great. With Sean Thomas, who plays Swifty, it was totally different. It was 2 months had gone by, we were getting nervous that we couldn't find anyone. How are we going to find this person? Amy had been around most of the schools at this point, had done such thorough research in the communities, getting to know people, and it was almost one of the last auditions she did. And at that point we actually had Connor initially read for the role of Swifty, so Connor was always in our heads as being Swifty, so we were still trying to find Arbor. And then at the point where we saw Sean, this was almost a sort of light bulb moment about maybe it was about swapping the roles and Sean being Swifty, because Sean actually came from a background of growing up around horses, is a total natural with horses, and had been scrapping himself since he was 10 years old. So we sort of found this boy who very much fitted the character we were looking for. And once that sort of settled as an idea, there was no turning back. And on set, I can only just say they were absolutely fantastic, and they were so professional, and just a real pleasure to work with. We found our horses because we always knew that with the action in the film we would need a stunt coordinator, and we found a stunt coordinator who's also a horse master. She's called Abby Collins. She's very experienced, and she had lived in Yorkshire many years ago, and when I first spoke to her she said, well, I explained the story, and I explained that we were looking for a working cob horse and a trotting horse. And she mentioned a man called Jimmy Tate who owned a riding school, and she knew that he had connections with the traveller community and with road racing, that he would know about that world. And she suggested we just phone him, and Clive and I, in fact, I phoned him and then we went up to meet him. And he had sulkies on site at the stables. He had pictures of trotting horses, trotting in arenas. So he knew about that world, and he had a lot of connections. And when it came to finding the horses, we basically said what we wanted. And he found us Ragdoll, who plays Tarmac Tommy, who is the most trustworthy, good-natured, easy, non-reactionary horse I think possibly that there is, and that's what Ragdoll did, collected scrap. Was taken scrap collecting. And when it came to Junior, who plays Diesel, also likewise, a bit more frisky natured, I suppose, but still in terms of the safety of the boys being paramount, and the crew around horses, and how unpredictable it can be working with animals. I think from the stories I've heard from other films, the film gods were looking down on us, or they were just perfect. There are a lot of people within the community who keep horses, and whether that's keeping horses on public land or at riding stables, or there seems to be, I think a love affair may be overstating it, but this real connection with horse culture up there that I haven't seen in other cities. Matty, as I said, built these stables and had 2 of his own horses. A lot of the boys have horses up there, and it's not uncommon to be in a car and overtaking a scrap cart that's being ridden by a horse, something that maybe harks back to Victorian times, which I think is something that Clive found so fascinating about this contemporary, the world of the now, but these boys using these means of transport from the Victorian era. And it's a fascinating microcosm, and I'm just not sure that exists outside Bradford in that particular way. I mean, the power station is a particular one, because that was one that was actually outside Bradford, that we found very late on. Clio had wanted somewhere where you could have the cooling towers, but also possibly had a working grid. They're very rare now in this country, cooling towers. They've all started to be pulled down in the last 10 to 15 years. And it was actually through Google Earth, through some searching, I got onto a government website, found the only sort of, I think, 10 that are decommissioned, and then just did some Google Earth searches, and then found one in Derbyshire, and sort of presented it saying, well, I know we're not supposed to be filming outside Bradford, but this seems to be a spectacular location with these towers still decommissioned but still standing, but right next to sort of what is a working grid. So we went down there, and it just was so dramatic, and it really echoed some of these places where Clive had done a lot of research about people breaking into disused power stations, and it really seemed like the perfect landscape for that, that we'd been trying very hard to find, because obviously there's, as I said, a lot of these places are decommissioned. The environment probably is not, there's the health and safety issues about going into those places, and that's part of the reason the permissions are very hard to get. And as I said, some of them have just been pulled down. They don't exist. They're just building sites. So we were very lucky. It was very touch and go whether we were going to get permission to film there, but at the last minute they agreed. I think the most enjoyable part, again, was connecting with people up in Bradford who are really great, warm, welcoming. And one thing I did want to mention was that initially the giant in the story was a debt collector. And through Clio spending time with Matty and his friends scrap collecting, that part of the story evolved, that the giant became a scrap man. But I have to say, all the scrap dealers we met could not have been more generous, kind-hearted, so forthcoming with information, and it is such a fascinating world. So I think that when you come away with having sort of forged further really good relationships with the local people and people you work with, I think that that's the most enjoyable, rewarding part of it.